Welcome to the Huge Talks by Huge Thing podcast, and embark on a journey through the world of innovation. We will introduce you to the secrets of innovation management based on inspiring stories from practitioners.
Originating from Poland, Europe, with professional career in San Francisco Bay Area and acting also in Asia, the man with a global overview of the innovation ecosystem, Tomasz Kolodziejak, my today's guest. Hello, Tomasz.
Hey, happy to be here, Maryla.
Thank you for accepting the invitation. You've been acting as open innovation and investment leader at Samsung Electronics. You've also co-founded two startups. Currently, you're a mentor at Techstars, but also an investor. So it's almost all-in-one innovation ecosystem in one person, Tomasz. How do you do that? And how did you ended up in here, in such position and in the innovation world?
No, thank you for the introduction. That's very kind. I guess, yeah, you want me to take you through the story, the history?
Briefly.
Briefly, yeah. I think serendipitously, I've been in the Silicon Valley for roughly 12 years now. Obviously born in Poland, and so ended up in that ecosystem. And it's really hard not to have a startup, number one, in the Valley, and then not to be involved in innovation. It's almost impossible. So it wasn't my any success or achievement. But I've enjoyed it, very much. Coming from the startup world, understanding what startups go through in terms of fundraising. We raised about 8 million venture. And then we also worked with many corporates, which then allowed me at Samsung to kind of understand the other side of the startup world and to look at them through their own lens. And obviously, being at Samsung a couple of years allowed me to understand it from the corporate side. So I try to bridge these two worlds as much as I can.
So it's exactly what we at Huge do. And this is what we want to talk about today, meaning the open innovation, which from the corporate's perspective means opening up to external sources of innovative solutions. But first of all, if you could tell me, with your 12 years background in Silicon Valley, what does open innovation mean at all in there?
Yeah, I think, it became like a job description. Obviously, a lot of big corporates do that. It's like a actual job to scout the innovation. So it's, I guess, maybe a little bit ambiguous, but your main goal is bring the top startups to the corporate world, to your corporate sponsor, to your corporate, mothership, whichever company you work at. So obviously big companies in the Valley have open innovation units, and they have, venture units. So the bigger the company, it's like a whole spectrum of things. You would have, small grants. At Samsung, we had this Samsung Jumps program, where you get non-equity funding, and then, obviously there's some seed investments. There's all kinds of corporate venture capital, Samsung Ventures. So, the companies can take you throughout the whole spectrum of your evolution. And, in between, there's ways to work on a contract basis, on proof of concepts. If you have some kind of MVP or idea, they can take you through how to plug that in, or we can maybe build this together. So the whole idea is be close to innovation, and particularly in the Valley, it's the right place. Kind of the premise is we see innovation first. Whether that's always the case, maybe not. There's obviously Europe and other places where have been successful in implementing some innovation, particularly, or just innovating. But in general, broad strokes, obviously the top innovation happens on the West Coast in California. In this small stretch of land, whatever that is, 50 miles south of San Francisco.
Yes, and all the startups want to get there and become the unicorns and well recognized. Yes, so wrapping up, it means that open innovation in the Silicon Valley is mostly startup oriented, right? And From what you've said, I understand that it's completely natural for all the corporates in the area to actually do that, because in Poland, we have some awareness of the fact that startups can bring some innovation and maybe even some breakthrough, either technological or maybe in the business model or model of operating or reaching out to clients. But it's not very common for corporations in Poland actually to do that. So tell me also, please, whether this open innovation in the Valley, is it more about optimization and, improving the core business of those corporates or Samsung that you've worked at? Or is it about the long-term transformation? So what is the focus area in this
That's a good question. I think simply you can't afford not to do that. And especially, if you're a big enough company, but also smaller ones, they might, work with accelerators if they don't have an office. Typically, they would have at least one person responsible for some sort of innovation in the Valley, or a team like Samsung did or Google, and there's units and multiple offices for these big companies. We had several. Yeah, so from my experience, it's outside the core. So you're looking at stuff that transformational things. So what is the world going to look like in 5-10 years? And you try to predict that. And it's obviously hard, and you're making some bets, and often you don't get it right. But in the meantime, you learn a lot of things, and it's, again, kind of not, efficient financially not to make these predictions. Even if they're wrong, you actually find out a lot of things about, what the future could look like. And this could be, Gen Zs are going to be wearing Vision Pros and they're going to live in VR. Maybe not, right? And maybe that's, if you're kind of broad stroke prediction, what do you have to build from your perspective? Do you build content for that type of platform? And AR VR has been around for many years, and now it's kind of the big launch that Apple did, but Meta had it. Obviously, Samsung had some approaches there, but you're trying to predict what's the next platform. And if you're maybe a slightly smaller, how does that impact you, right? Is it going to completely, demolish your business model, or can you open some new things based on your predictions? So again, we kind of gather as a team and try to figure out what's the future going to look like.
Oh, sounds like a witchcraft a bit.
For sure.
But I guess it's data-driven.
Definitely data-driven. The caveat here, you don't have that much data, right? So often, when we meet, we would say, hey, this is, let's say 20,000 people do this now. It looks like several million people will do that in the future because of XYZ. So, and then, obviously you look at different reports of, there's some things that are fixed, like clearly we're advancing in AI in specific things. So you can sort of model that roughly how long it's going to take. Let's say it's possible, and what is that going to look like? And there's one more thing, there's no better way to do this than with startups, because we can kind of dream, sketch things all we want. But when you meet with these guys or girls in startups, they usually have this cutting edge, crazy future ideas, and they try to bring them to earth and try to figure out what could that look like. So really, a big part of the job is meeting with these startups, going to conferences and talking and trying to paint a picture of what this could look like in the future, and whether what they're building makes sense, or could it make sense. I think if it could make sense, that's enough.
Would you go for trying to estimate, like, what are the statistics when it comes to this, predicting the future? Because in the world of startups, we know that statistically, like 1 out of 10 will survive, right, in the long term. And how about those bets that you make as a corporation, like about what the future is going to look like? If you were about to, estimate, like, how many bets out of 10, for example, will be those golden shots?
Yeah. That's a tough one, because it's also long-term. So, let's say we see some kind of seed innovation, and then, a couple years, we might not be able to see it in fruition, or we might not be at this corporate. But, a good example, I've been at Samsung for 5 years, and early on, 5+ years ago, something like that, we looked at meditation, where nobody really thought. Now it's kind of like people shake their head. It's like, oh, meditation, obviously. You have it in your phone. It's like such a normal thing. Well, I think 5 years ago, nobody really thought that, or only a few people. Maybe that was just starting 5 years ago, but it was more like the monks would do meditation, and it wasn't related to digital space at all. And all of a sudden, there was Headspace, Calm, and all these other companies that did that. And this was the time where we signed an agreement with Calm to bring them to Samsung Health, and bring them to this multi-million user base with Samsung on the phones and TVs. So trying to predict that, and that's kind of a more down-to-earth example. And, it's easier to look in the past, what worked out, what not. But when you think about bets, I think it's also, changing the approach. Like, innovation is failure, and like repeated failure. And, similar like to baseball, you don't get many home runs. But when you do, it's a big celebration and that sort of thing. So you probably in your career don't get too many of those, but doesn't mean you shouldn't be playing, again, because you can't afford that. There's this little book. I have a 1.5-year-old daughter, and she hardly can read, but we have this innovation book, and it has like this NASA scientist. And it's like, what's innovation? It's just failure. And that's part of the process. And there isn't like this, at the end, you're going to get to something, but you actually have to do that. And that's kind of success of its own, right?
Yes, just making the effort. Yeah. Yes. Is it really, the title is the innovation book?
I don't
You
know. I'd
must
have to
show
check.
me.
I'll show you. But
Please
it's
check. Maybe we should, use it for corporations,
Yeah.
to build the awareness. So, like, what's the innovation about? You mentioned that it's failure, and it's not
Yeah.
encouraging at all. We prefer to say like experiments or making some tests and so on and so forth, because the upper management levels are allergic
Right.
to the words like failure, loss, and so on and so forth.
Yeah.
So yes, the wording is very important, but still the awareness that the risk is in there, right? It's a
Yeah.
natural part of innovation is also important. Okay, so it's about, you mentioned also the time horizons, right? You mentioned like 5 years ago. So I wonder, like, what should be the planning horizon for corporations in general when they want to, go for innovation and especially focus on transformational technologies or innovation at all?
Yeah, so the team for us was 5 to 10 years, or at least N+3. And I think there's multiple parallel processes, right? There's lots of engineering happening at these companies working on like truly big breakthrough innovation. So like virtual assistant, companies been working on that for past 10 years. Is it good now? Not really. Is it useful? I think it's beginning to be useful in a lot of ways. So I think there's many parallels happening. And you couple that with what company is doing on an engineering level and how you can bridge those new ways. Again, looking at platforms, maybe metaverse, there's often these big buzzwords and trying to decipher, does that really mean anything or should we look beyond? Like I think big change, I think already known that a lot of companies, especially electronic companies, are looking at is digital health and how people are going to track themselves, look at longevity. You see that even in the younger generation, or millennials or Gen Zs, right? Sort of, treating their bodies and, checking what they're putting into them and tracking sleep. Tracking sleep has been around for the past 15, 20 years, but it's gotten better. And, looking at these variety of indicators and having data for them, how we can change our behaviors.
Yeah, I really like this direction of actually humans' predictive maintenance in a way, right?
100%.
When it comes to health.
Yeah.
I love it, actually.
Huge. And there's so many things that we're not tracking. You probably heard of Brian Johnson. He's the guy that spends about $2 million and he's like the most tracked person and he uses all kinds of things. But he's kind of obviously the extreme. But I think average human is going to be able to track themselves more efficiently, much better than what we think. We're so subjective. We wake up feeling good. Does that mean we got good sleep or not? But there's so many different things that we can track. A few years ago, there was this big rush with a company called Levels, I think 3 years ago, during the pandemic, the CGM, the constant glucose patches, and then kind of became a trend. Anyway, I think there's a lot of different things, and particularly for companies like Samsung or Apple or Google to help folks feel better and improve that digital health, whether that's mental health or physical health. And those are obviously two related.
There are many exciting directions and areas, right, to explore. It's really great. Could you tell me, like from the practical point of view of such innovators team within corporations, have you been using any tools at Samsung Electronics that allowed you to, perhaps analyze the data and doing this forecasting work, which is difficult?
Yeah. So we used a lot of third-party reports, kind of generational data on consumer behavior. So how are the generation acting differently? Let's say in big cities in New York or San Francisco. How's that different? Where's that taking us? What's the usage of electronics, general health, stuff like that. And we also use some data aggregation tools in terms of startups. How many startups are trying to solve this problem? Is that an indication that this is a problem for people? Mm-hmm. How much have they raised? Then we talk to them, try to couple this with some Samsung data that we have on hand potentially. Obviously there's a large user base that we have. So there's some internal data that we use, some external data, and some, just kind of conversational argument building. Mm-hmm. Could this work? And then, we have this room where we try to poke holes in all these arguments. And the moment you it's really hard to poke holes, then maybe we then pitch it to executives.
Yeah, I know that Samsung Electronic it was actually like a special purpose vehicle, we might call it, devoted to looking those long-term horizon innovation, right? Long-term innovation, transformational innovation. And I wonder, like, what is the connection with the rest of the business at the company, right? Because usually those innovation departments, labs, however they are called, at various corporations, they have to be connected to the business units, right? Because some part of innovation is dedicated to their, everyday problems or challenges. So I wonder what was the case at Samsung.
Yeah, I mean, look, at the end of the day, it is a company that has its certain objectives and making profits and things like that. So we do talk to business units or bring these startups to specific business units and try to figure out, what this could look like in the future. It's just the incentive for the business units is probably next couple years or now, right? If you're going to introduce a product, they're more go-to-market strategy teams in New Jersey. So they want to introduce a product soon. We're looking at how could this evolve, right? Is
In
this
the
still
long-term
going to be
vision,
on the phone or not? If it's not on the phone, then mobile business unit should look at it, but maybe that's not their kind of first hunch to look at, right?
Some business units might not have liked you, actually, if you were about to tell them that they will not exist in the next 5 or 10 years.
No, there is some pressures, how the business units are making money now, and is that going to be the same, right? Where's the funding going to
Definitely not.
Right. Likely not. Or is the business going to be completely commoditized? Samsung builds so much hardware, but maybe that's not where the revenue comes from, right? Hardware is, could be made cheaper. It's all about, the platforms and software. So I think, what helps here, release these tensions, we have this special kind of position in the company where we get to talk to the executives once or twice a year. They come to Silicon Valley from Seoul. And, we do this pitch, actually, session where we say, look, this is what we think this is going to look like. Those are the data points. It's kind of like one of the hardest presentations you can do because, these guys have seen so much. Yeah. It's not, obviously they're
not easy to impress them, right?
Yeah, they're obviously intelligent people, but they've seen so much, right? That's kind of their job to see it, and they're kind of immersed in what's happening on the business level as well. So being able to convince them that this is what the future looks like, and try to keep an open mind or open their minds in a way because they're so immersed in, what's happening right now. And the executives at these companies, probably the usual term is 4 or 5 years, right? So it's not going to matter for them in their term. So that's kind of an obstacle as well. But, when you look at it, so Samsung in the good quarters made about $16 billion in profit. That's just profit. So that's also in their top of mind. This little innovation SaaS thing you brought, software, it's nice and cute, but it's generating some insignificant amount of money. How long is it going to take to make any sense for a company like that? So those are kind of the challenges that we deal with. But again, we have the audience, which is amazing. And I think a lot of companies do that, kind of, bring direct line with the executives, with the CEOs, which is really nice. And we often showcase the startups and sort of paint the picture of, hey, this is what this could look like.
Yes, so I wonder how can startups fit into such approach and such expectations that, facing a 16 billion profit, what scale and potential profitability that they must show and prove to, get attention of such a giant.
Right. No, I mean, that's impossible. Obviously, the understanding is you're not going to start with 16 billion or even 1 billion. If you're valued 1 billion, that's actually
that's
nice.
easy, yeah, sure.
You're a unicorn, you made it. So, no, I mean, I would say when we look at them, which is around seed stage, a little bit further than seed stage, is not often just hockey stick. Like for VCs, you have presentations with hockey sticks, going to explode. But also, are you going to be around in the next couple of years? Because, like we mentioned earlier, 90% of startups fail. So often for these big corporates, it's not just a hockey stick when they work with companies, but are they going to be around? Are they going to be able to sustain this large user base if we let them in for 100 million phones? So can you do that? And, you don't have to grow exponentially as much, or you can grow with us exponentially.
Yeah. So how can startups actually get ready to effectively approach corporation and make it their client?
Yeah. So I think that's kind of the idea is you're a startup, so you're going to grow fast. Part of the reason we're working with you, it's because it would take us so long, right? Build the unit, fund it, go through kind of the bureaucratic, chains of command and things like that. You can do it so much faster, and maybe you have an outside perspective. You don't have to be tied to the corporate. So you have to grow fast, and you have to kind of think outside the box. The way I think good way to work with corporates, like my job was to shield from that corporate mess, or this, corporate mess is maybe a bad word, but this complexities, right? My role is to understand you, what you're trying to do, and sell it internally, speaking their language, right? Which is more based on, maybe bigger vision tied to how we can work together. So slightly more realistic approach. Being able to bridge those two worlds is kind of, I think, the success. But I think I missed your main question, is how to get in touch.
Yeah.
So let's say, I think one thing is, if you're building something that could be interesting for Samsung or whatever big corporate, Fortune 100, it's good to know what are the problems that these companies are facing, right? Or will face. Even better if that's something in the future you see they're going to face. And you can, sort of relatively easily Google that, right? You can see, especially for public companies, you can see what are some of the things that will be on the horizon. Or even better, in your vision, this part of the world is going to change, and this is how you're going to need this. And then crafting that pitch, and this is how we can work with the big corporate is really helpful. So actually building this into your presentation, this is how we can work with Samsung or Google or, whatever, Salesforce.
Yeah, so actually focus on a genuine problem, either current one or the future-oriented, right? Based on some predictions that you mentioned also. Okay, I wonder because, we also work both with startups and with corporates, and we know that for startups, it's very difficult to, find the right person to talk to, right? So how to do that from your perspective? You've been there. What was the best way? What is still the best way to approach you or other persons from other corporates as well?
I think that should be the least difficult part of the equation, but I understand, like, finding the right person. Maybe that's kind of the point. I think number one, I would try to reach out to folks in Silicon Valley. From my experience, the teams in other places are useful, but the teams in the Valley, at least from my experience, they have specific KPIs to bring these startups and find the best startups. Even if you're international, maybe, go outside of home country and go directly to the Valley. Find these teams and you can relatively easily find them on LinkedIn. So, number one, who are you solving a problem in the future? Is that Johnson & Johnson? Is that pharmaceuticals? You probably know that because you've been building this for a minute. And then identify at least, 10, 15 corporates like that. And just look at it from more like engineering standpoint, and identify these specific folks. And usually they have, titles like open innovation or venture something or head of innovation for Johnson & Johnson in Silicon Valley or in San Francisco.
And they are responsive, right? Because I know that in Poland, sometimes people get stuck with, messages at LinkedIn and they do not read them, right?
Yeah, so that's true. I get a ton of LinkedIn messages. So that's where the kind of art of reaching out comes into play, right? So these guys or girls get a lot of messages, and it's mainly uninteresting or spam.
So how to write it? Do you expect pitch decks attached from the first contact, or there must be something in the text that's actually appealing?
I'd definitely put something in the text. So one way is LinkedIn, the other one in-person events. So Samsung would have them, all the big corporates would have them, or try to identify these people in person. But LinkedIn, so there's a kind of a funnel. Not everybody's going to respond, but if you write them effectively, which means maximum one paragraph, because nobody reads long things, that means you didn't put enough effort to actually condense this. So write maximum one paragraph of what problem your Samsung, your startup is trying to solve for my specific corporate. And then, try to hook something like, I did research about this at Stanford, or some reputable, I raised money from Andreessen Horowitz, or, I have 1 million customers, something that stands out, right? There's so many startups these days. You kind of try to stand out from the crowd. And if your problem is really in line with what I'm looking at or what I'm interested in, I'm definitely going to have at least 30-minute conversation or somebody from the team. And then, look at it again more like a sales approach. So identify these folks. There are corporates, so maybe they take vacations, not everybody will respond. But if you have 10, and then let's say 2-3 people at each corporate, and then message them, see what works. Does that problem resonate? And things like that. And then follow up, right? So people maybe glance at it, maybe that was interesting. But again, you get the volume of these messages. So a week passes, just follow up. Simple as that.
Sounds very easy. I think we can, just invite our listeners to let us know who succeeded in such a way, or what problems you faced.
If you send me these messages, I'll respond to those that look interesting.
Yes. Okay. So starting from after the publication of our episode, we will check.
But there's a couple more ways that are effective that I've seen. I would say deck might not be as necessary for the first one. I would just do a blurb, something very concise and specific. You can add Calendly link. Look, I'm available this, pick a time. You could do a video. Videos are so much more effective than text. If there's a short follow-up from me saying, hey, let's chat, then send a deck. And also that deck should be very clean and simple. Maximum 10 pages.
Yeah, thank you for saying this. Yes, not 20.
Definitely not 20, max 10. And then, probably a few sentences per slide, mainly images. You're trying to convey a message. Humans can't, consume that much messages, nor they want to, and they're so spammed with all these other things. So just that communication doesn't work.
Yeah, so it's a very precise recipe for being effective. Yeah. So we'll do
I think it works. I think it works. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. So looking from the other side, you've mentioned some tips for startups, how to approach potential corporate clients or partners, and how can corporate innovation teams and people or those scouts actually get ready, not only scouts, but the entire organization as well, especially if they are, the beginners in this open innovation theme. What should they prepare before they reach out for startups?
I think they should know roughly, so sort of the work we did, or at least have an idea what they think, where the world is going, what's kind of the tectonic changes they think, and try to match startups to that vision. So let's say, maybe a few years ago you thought metaverse is a thing, who is in that space? It's a very complicated space, right? But maybe because there's a hardware headsets, maybe there is content, who's already in that space, and then break it down into, different pieces. And then what is the piece that is crucial and strategic for us? Maybe we're never going to build headsets, but we can play the content game or the fintech or whatever that is. So identifying those within, and, LinkedIn is such an effective tool, or conferences, just finding these startups. And startups, obviously respond, right? If a big corporate reaches out, I've had almost 100% success. It's just a matter of expectations on the other side. Typically, when I reach out, it's often also research. Mm-hmm. So, maybe we don't have huge plans with working with this company, not because they're a bad startup, or maybe it's just not the piece we're looking for, or maybe it's just not the right timing, right? Same way you hear from VCs. So, maybe let's get in touch in 6 months. There's nothing wrong with that. You're just
5 years.
not there. 5 years might be too long. They'll probably be gone. And then let's chat. Typically, the expectation is when you reach out, they're like, "Oh my God, we're gonna do all this big deal," and maybe that's not the thing to do for both parties, right? Maybe it's not.
Yeah. So what you mentioned is actually from the corporate's perspective, it's about a general orientation within a particular area of technology, for example, right? So what's already available, what's new, and what's not. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, you risk wasting your time for something who promises or trying to sell you something which is already available and just like a new normal, right? That maybe someone has not known that. Mm-hmm. We also know from our experience and working with corporates that it's very important to prepare dedicated or so-called fast tracks, dedicated processes, or fast tracking this formal path in order to effectively work with startups. You perfectly know that startups cannot afford to wait 6 months for payments, or maybe waiting 1 year for signing the agreement might be too long, right? Definitely. Because everybody gets excited if you're a startup that they're going to work with some giants. Yeah. But if it's not happening for like a couple of months, then maybe it's not going to happen, right? So summing up this preparing this internal corporate formalities and this formal path is also important. Tomasz, I thought that perhaps it would be an interesting idea for us, interesting for listeners, if we came up with such a list of terrible things or the worst thing that you can do in order not to make the open innovation actually successful from both corporate and startup perspective. What do you think?
Yeah, that's a good one. And couple one quick thought on the previous question. If the LinkedIn doesn't work, I just don't want to be pinned for this. Find a common connection, right? That's just like any introduction works. If you're connected to someone that knows somebody at Samsung, try to get a warm introduction. That always works really well. Going back to your question.
Sure. Yeah, how to make it in the worst possible way. Yeah. If you're a startup and you want to approach corporation, of course, it's not that we recommend doing it. We recommend something completely opposite, just to make it clear, the message clear. But yes, like what could be the worst way of acting?
I think so. From a corporate standpoint, there's this tendency to kind of hug the startup to death, like overwhelm them with reports and things, which defeats the purpose of being a startup. The reason, it is a startup and it could do things that the corporates can because they have more flexibility. Maybe people are fully committed, working some crazy hours or whatever that may be. They are a startup and it works and they're much more nimble and things like that. So if you overwhelm them with some kind of paperwork, some kind of agreements, deadlines, that might fire back at you. It's a bit of an art. How do you, make sure you get certain things from a startup without doing that? So I think trying to be very transparent and open, like what is possible, and let's chat in the next 2-3 months. Keep us updated. But don't impose kind of the corporate bureaucracy on them too much. It will already happen. Conversations with legal, even with a startup, it's relatively streamlined for us. There's simple NDAs that we always sign, and just to calm the companies. And whenever there's an agreement, there's a lot of already legal, but try to make it as easy as possible for them. That's one. Two, I think having a transparent path, what success looks like. And, look, we're going to try to test your technology for 2 months. If it doesn't work, that's fine. You can just keep working on some other piece of it, not kind of parading these startups to different executives. Because, part of your job and innovation is showcasing these startups, but it's not necessarily fair to take the time away from the startups and showcasing them to another VP just to show a good startup, have a clear direction. Hey, we're going to try with mobile because this is kind of the future. And let's do that. And again, having some clear deliverables. So, and startups can be open about it and can say, okay, if we deliver on this, what's the next path? Is this going to be a paint contract? Is that the best for everybody? Is there a path for equity? Do you have some grants? There's typically a lot of tools at these big corporates, and it may not be in my specific office, but the venture teams could step in, right? Maybe you need some runway to deliver for these X number of users and things like that. Mm-hmm. So
I also thought about, I don't know if you agree, about the bad things that you can do if you're a corporate and you don't want this corporate startup cooperation to be successful, is do not tell startups about some limitations, within the corporates, like that technologically something is not possible. Just wait as long as possible before they discover it in 6 months, right? And then it turns out that, for example, POC is not going to happen, right? We've seen such cases that actually some important technological aspects have not been checked at the very beginning.
Wow.
Actually, both sides spent half a year preparing for a pilot, which was not doable in the end. So this is also an important aspect to address. What you said about the KPIs, I definitely agree, right? It's important for startups to know that if the business or the corporate in general has some KPIs and the startup can support meeting them, it's worth telling from the very beginning. So this transparency is very important. Okay, so when it comes to bad advice for startups, how to make things not happen and do not start cooperation with corporates, what can they not do?
I think with any partnership, as much as possible, being open about the problems or potential hurdles is nice because, again, there's a whole variety of tools that the corporates could help potentially. If funding is an issue, that's usually an easy one, or maybe some technological barriers, we've often worked with engineering teams to, help these guys with particular hurdle or something that they're struggling with. So, as much as possible being open about these problems ahead of time, then we can account for them.
Yes,
together.
From our, Polish perspective of this corporate and this exciting corporate and startup overview, I would advise startups not to make any research about the corporate that they are about to approach. Just don't do that. Go with your pitch deck and check what's going to happen. No, but seriously, we hear from the corporate innovation people that startups do not get prepared. If you have a capital group of, multiple companies, like 30 or 40, startups very often do not know which one to address with their solution, where to fit in, and they do not have this value proposition that corporates expect. So this is one thing that it's important for you as a startup to deliver. And another thing is over-promising. We've seen that in one of our acceleration program, when a startup actually sold the idea very effectively, to everybody, who they met on the road before getting to the corporate and planning a POC, that they have promised to deliver something that was not even, at the beginning of preparation, right? Mm-hmm. And they actually failed to do that within 6 months because it was not possible.
Right.
Did you have such experiences as well?
Yeah, I think kind of that's the part of the industry, right? Over-promising, but there's obviously a fine line. Can you catch up in that short amount of time or not? Or you haven't even tested this. So that's a tough one. One thing about the research of the corporation, I think one tip, again, going back to your question, is that the startup could use, you can find companies that the corporate worked with. So let's say, Samsung, maybe Calm Meditation. They're a bit of a huge company at this point, but you can see in the portfolio companies that these corporates work with, and you can talk to them. And there's, much better chemistry between startups and say, hey, how long did it take them? Were they just promising for 3 months and not doing anything? Were they parading you in front of these executives and there wasn't any funding or any contract? What was your hurdles? And you would find that it could be useful. Keeping in mind there's a bias. Typically, if a corporate puts a logo with the startup they worked with, it's typically a positive experience, but I think it's worth going through that.
Yeah, so looking for a reference, actually. It's probably the same way that actually corporates act, right? They also ask for reference from the previous partners or clients of a given startup.
Definitely.
So that's a good advice. I can hear that you very, very much, Tomasz, stick to this, ideas of how to get the right person. But yes, from our experience, it's a difficult part. So thank you for this advice. Tomasz, I know that we could talk for hours, and exploring the topic of corporate and startup cooperation. But for this now, thank you for our conversation. My guest was Tomasz Kolodziejak, Open Innovation and Investment Leader at Samsung Electronics, startups co-founder, also investor and mentor for startups. Thank you.
Thanks so much. No, I enjoyed it. We should do it again.
Yeah, definitely.
Take care.
See you.
Check out other episodes of our podcast on the Mam Startup website.